Hello, I'm Dick Billows, and we'll be working together on the course. So let me tell you a bit about my background so you know who you're dealing with. I'm a certified project management professional from PMP, and the Gartner Institute has also given me a certification in IT project management. I was a partner in the fourth largest professional firm in the world, Grant Thornton International, managing projects all over the United States and overseas in South America, the Near East, and Africa. In addition to individual projects, I moved up after a while and managed large programs for clients and portfolios of projects for multiple clients. Then I was recruited by a Fortune 200 company, SmithKline, to manage their hundreds of projects and project managers in a 14-state region. After that, I started 4pm.com, where I've worked with more than 300 organizations in the United States and abroad, developing their project managers and improving their project management processes. The techniques covered in this course are based on my 25 years of experience managing projects and, as importantly, developing project managers. Project Management Institute has reviewed and approved this course as teaching the best practices in project management, and is consistent with the current edition of their project management body of knowledge. In sum, I know what works in project management because I've been there and I've done it. Our focus here is exclusively on what works in the real world, not theories or vague concepts. Okay, let's talk about the project scope. It is a biggie in project management. The scope defines what the project sponsor wants you to deliver at the end of the project. Sometimes the scope is a tangible deliverable, like a 9-story office building. Other times, the scope is a new clinic with trained nurses and techs that can serve 200 patients a day. Alternatively, the scope could be a computer information system that processes and issues electronic paychecks for 10,000 people at a cost of $2.25 each. Each scope needs a crystal clear definition of what you're going to deliver, like the examples I gave you. Notice they all had numbers. If we don't know what the project sponsor, the boss, or the customer wants, we have to guess, and our odds of success are very, very low when I don't know what the sponsor wants me to deliver. You've seen some examples of a good scope statement, good scope definitions that are crystal clear and measurable. However, there's a lot of confusion about what the scope statement is and what it is not. You'll hear a lot of bad information. The scope is a deliverable, something we produce for the project sponsor. It's not the due date or the budget or the first thing we're going to do. And it surely is not the technical specifications. It's the business outcome of the project. With a good definition of the scope, we're able to control the project and avoid doing anything that does not contribute to producing the deliverable that the boss, customer, or sponsor wants. A good scope statement lets us make clear assignments to the project team, as well as make accurate estimates and track progress accurately. Now, too many projects are started without a good scope definition, and that is the #1 cause of failure. It leaves the project manager in a situation where he or she can't control changes or track progress. Also, the PM is stuck giving team members vague assignments about what they're supposed to do. All that wastes time and money. On the illustration, you see examples of bad scope statements, and then how we have converted them into good scope statements by asking the sponsor the right questions. Let's analyze the first example. A scope to be a low-cost leader may sound good, but we have no real idea of what we have to deliver. We have no idea what's good enough or what low cost means, nor do we understand what will satisfy the customer or the boss. When we ask some questions to find out what the boss or customer actually wants, we can convert that vague statement about being a low-cost leader into something very specific, like cut operating costs by $10,000 a month. Then we know exactly what the boss wants. Other examples on the chart are similar. On the left, we have a typical kind of a statement that people use to define a project that causes a mess. If we ask the right questions, after we hear one of those statements on the left, we can convert it into a metric, something that is measurable, like the examples on the right-hand side. So when the sponsor says we need to become a low-cost leader, your follow-on question is, well, how much do we have to cut costs to be a low-cost leader? If the sponsor doesn't give you an answer, you might throw out a possible metric like, would a $10,000 cost reduction make us a low-cost leader? If the boss agrees, you have a good metric. If he gives you a different number, you still have a good metric. Defining the scope is the hardest thing in project management. I'll teach you how to ask the right questions and how to overcome the obstacles that get in the way of defining the scope properly. Let's look at the big picture of scope as you see on the slide. The first thing we have to do is meet with the decision maker, with the project sponsor. Project manager can't decide what the scope of the project is, nor can the boss's assistant or secretary or some subordinate manager. They're unlikely to know how the project fits into the bigger picture that the boss or the customer has in mind. Now, if the boss or the customer tries to delegate decision-making about the scope, you are headed for failure. So a little polite pushback to get a few minutes of the boss's time is worth it. Frankly, the sponsor, the customer, or the boss has to define the scope. That's their role on the project. When you get the boss or the customer to sit down for a few minutes to discuss the scope, use your time well. By using your time well, I mean you don't do a lot of talking. Project managers should do very little talking in this session. We want to ask one or two open-ended questions that get the boss talking about the project results. The PM should sit back and listen. Zip it. Listen for the deliverables that the boss wants. Getting the boss to talk is usually not difficult, as most executives like to talk. So you should ask them questions like, what will the department be like 6 months after this project is done? How will things be different? How will things be better? Notice, those are open-ended questions that can't be answered with a yes or a no. They get the boss talking. Once that flow of information starts, let it go and just listen. As the boss talks, you're listening intently and with encouraging nods. You understand, yes. You need to convert those vague wishes into deliverables the boss wants and document those deliverables as the boss talks. That's what the big picture is. Now let's get into the details of that meeting. Now let's go back over the process in detail. The first step in planning the scope is to get a meeting with the project sponsor or your boss or the customer. Your project will fail if you have the scope definition meeting with anybody other than the person who will judge the success of your project at the end. Key point. Therefore, if the project sponsor tries to delegate the scope planning to their assistant or a secretary or a supervisor, you need to politely push back. You need to explain that it's going to be impossible for you to give the sponsor what he or she wants if you don't find out what that is. And it's unlikely that other people will be able to tell you what is in the sponsor's mind. Therefore, you have to make a big effort to get a meeting with the sponsor, but it doesn't have to be a long one. You need to stress that. Second step is that you as the project manager do very little talking in the meeting. This is not the time to try and impress the sponsor with your technical skills. Too many project managers do this. And if you try that, the executive may never meet with you again. Instead, you want to ask one or two open-ended questions about the project's end results and let the sponsor talk. Most executives like to do the talking as you sit attentively, nodding and taking notes. While the stream of words is coming out, you're listening for activities that you can convert to deliverables, as we've done, and come up with the metrics, just like you saw a few slides back. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Sometimes getting a good scope statement is easy, particularly when the customer or the sponsor is savvy about projects and knows the value of a clear scope statement. But other times, the project manager needs to overcome a lot of obstacles to get the scope of the project defined. Some executives talk in generalities about mission statements. Well, that has a place. It is not a project scope definition. It's too mushy. Other executives, particularly those who have not decided what they want, talk about you starting now and doing the planning later. That is a project death trap, because much money and time will be wasted doing the wrong things while the boss is trying to decide. Still, other executives are too busy to plan, and others will join the planning effort, but all they want to do is discuss the tiny details of the first task you're going to do. The response to all these barriers is to explain how having a crystal clear definition of the scope, the end result, substantially increases the odds of success in a project. Not defining the scope almost certainly dooms a project to failure, and you need to tell the sponsor that. You're a new project manager just hired by your organization, and one of the department managers calls you up about doing a small project. So you talk on the phone, and the manager says, "What I want you to do is straighten up the supply room. It's a stinky mess." And you were hoping for a little bit bigger time project, but on the other hand, it'd be good to build credibility with the other department managers, and obviously a lot of people use the supply room, so it'd be a good one. And obviously, it's important that this manager be happy with your work when you're done. So you hang up and start thinking about what kind of automation you need, what kind of systems, what kind of physical arrangement of the supply room may be good, and the database behind it, and how to build the shelves. And then you realize you're caught in the activity trap. You're diving into the details before you understand the scope of the job. And without knowing the scope, you could build a great system and new shelves and still not solve the manager's problem. So you step back and use your scope planning techniques. Contact the manager, ask for another meeting, and you say, "I understand you want to clean up the file room with maybe new systems and shelves and so forth, but I want to be sure I understand what the problem is so I give you the right result. I need to know what problem you have in the file room and what you want solved, how you're measuring, how things will be different so that I can deliver that result." The department manager frowns and says, "I thought you were a project manager. Why don't you just start work?" You say, "Well, I am a project manager, but I want you to be delighted with my work at the end of the project, which means the whole project has to be a success. That's why I'd like to know what problem you want solved so that I can focus all of my energy on solving that problem and not doing any things that don't contribute to fixing the problem." The department manager nods and says, "That makes sense. My employees are wasting too much time getting supplies they need out of the supply room. Sometimes they spend 20 minutes digging through the crap trying to find something. That's why I want a whole new system and shelves and everything else. The supply room is a mess, and despite all the memos I send out, people never put supplies where they belong. In addition, we're running out way too often, and that wastes even more time. So I need you to fix all that stuff and cut the time it takes to get supplies. Now you think about that for a minute and say, okay, it's taking too long now. How long should it take for one of your employees to get a supply out of the supply room? And the customer manager leans back and says, most of the time, people should be able to find the supply they need in less than 2 minutes. You nod, think for a moment, and say, that's a very clear goal. Just to make it explicit, let's say 85% of the time, people can retrieve the supply they need in less than 2 minutes. Is that the end result that would make you decide this project's a success? The department manager nods and says, yes, if you do that, this project will be a success. You thank the department manager and say to yourself, I've got a good scope definition. Now I can go to work. You may be asking yourself, why does he want us to spend so much time asking these questions of the project sponsor? Well, the answer is that we substantially improve the odds of success by defining what the project has to deliver in measurable terms. That means numbers, as you've been seeing, or yes-nos, as you've also seen. But every deliverable in the project is defined with an acceptance criteria that tells everybody what we have to deliver and how it will be measured. So we start, as you've seen, with a clear scope. Then next we're going to talk about identifying 4 to 7 high-level deliverables that lead to that scope. And then when we gather requirements in the next module, we'll also be looking for the same kind of measured deliverables. So, as you can see on the chart, the reason we do this is how the probability of project failure decreases as we define each of the deliverables in measurable form. That's why we do it, and it's why the best project managers build outstanding track records of consistent project success with well-defined deliverables. That's the reason we're spending so much time. With the scope defined, our next step is to decompose it, which is fancy language for, or break it into 4 to 5, maybe 7 sometimes, high-level deliverables that lead us from where we are now to the scope. It's the major steps we're going to take in the project, as always, each defined as a measured deliverable. In a sense, these high-level deliverables are stepping stones to the scope. They are the backbone of our project, and will further subdivide them down to the level of individual assignments for our team. And those will be deliverables too. Another name for this process is top-down planning. We start with the scope and then break it down. It's the best way to plan projects, because when we have finished breaking the scope into its major components with the sponsor, we'll make them measurable too, and that'll give the sponsor the key checkpoints they'll need. Next, let's talk about the 2 options for decomposing the scope into deliverables. In the slide above, the blue high-level deliverables are produced in sequence, step by step. We produce the first major deliverable, and then we can start the second, which is waiting for the results of the deliverable of that first major high-level deliverable, and so on. We call this sequential decomposition. The other option is a parallel structure, where we can work on all 4 of the major deliverables in this project at the same time. We want to think about how we're going to decompose at this point, because it makes a big difference in our requirements gathering and the eventual development of your schedule. We can also find that in some larger projects, we have a mix of these 2 alternatives. The project manager says to the manager who's sponsoring the project, okay, we have a scope that your people can find their supplies in 2 minutes or less 85% of the time. Project manager nods and says, okay, let's talk about the major deliverables that we have to produce that will take us from where we are now to the goal of finding supplies in 2 minutes or less. Sponsor says with a smile, wow, you're really thorough. Project manager answers, this is the only way I can be sure that you're going to get exactly what you defined in the scope of the project, is to break it down into the pieces that will deliver that scope. The sponsor smiles and says, okay, you're right. We need to build the right sort of shelves. And to do that, we need to have a design about how we're going to store our supplies. Project manager nods agreement and says, that design has to be aimed at finding supplies in less than 2 minutes and not running out so often. A very knowledgeable person who knows your whole supply situation and knows who to talk to about the different things you need and how much of them should do the design. Sponsor says, well, my office administrator, Pearl, is the perfect person, and she can talk to everybody who uses the supply room and come up with a design and set the reorder quantities. Project manager nods and says, I think the measure of that design deliverable should be that you approve the design. You'll look at it, think about it, maybe talk to your other people, and make a judgment that the design will let people find supplies in less than 2 minutes. I'll work with Pearl on integrating her design with the other activities, particularly the systems development that's going to be happening. The sponsor agrees and says, okay, what's next? You have the analyst build the software? Project manager says, yes, as soon as you and your staff approve the systems design and accept the criteria that you're going to use when the software is presented for final approval. We define those acceptance criteria now so they can design to it. Sponsor says, then are we done? Project manager says, not quite. At the same time, the systems people are writing the software. Pearl's going to be figuring out the reorder points for all the items so we don't run out of stock so often. Let's define that. Does no more than 5 stockouts each month sound right? Sponsor thinks and says, yeah, that would be a lot better than we're doing now. Project manager nods and goes on. Next, we need to teach your people, the ones who order supplies, how to stock the new shelves according to the design and how to use the reorder reports we're going to get out of the system. I think they should pass a test after training, don't you? Sponsor laughs and says, that's right. Fail the test and no more reordering until you pass it. Okay, now are we done? Well, there's a 5th deliverable, the project manager says. We have to teach everybody how to get the supplies out of the supply room so they learn the design and can find things as quickly as we want within 2 minutes. They have to pass a test too. The project manager thinks for a minute, and the sponsor says maybe they should show us that they can find 5 items in 10 minutes as a test of how well they know the supply room. The project manager nods and says, we have 5 deliverables now and we're ready to go. Sponsor agrees and project manager adds, I need to break these high-level deliverables down into smaller pieces. To do that, I need to meet with the people who are going to be accountable for those deliverables so that they're clear on their accountability and they can tell me what they need. It won't take but 30 minutes. Sponsor says, I'll set it up for tomorrow. This way of planning makes everything clear And doing this thinking avoids a lot of problems down the road. Project manager just nods. We've covered a number of critical techniques in this module. First, I stress the importance of meeting with the right decision maker, the person who's sponsoring the project and will be the judge of its success at the end. I also focused on the project manager keeping his or her mouth shut for most of the planning session. Instead, you want to engage in active listening with a lot of eye contact and nodding and close attention to everything the executive says. That encourages almost everyone to do a lot of talking. We all like an attentive audience. As you're listening to the executive talk and asking your open-ended questions, you're converting unmeasurable wishes, wants, and desires into hard-edged metrics. You're asking, how low does the error rate have to be? Or, how many items would be acceptable to have on the punch list? When you have your sponsor's agreement on those metrics for the major deliverables, you're ready to move into requirements gathering.